Do you know, the very first time I met Jean Marsh, it was a real sort of embarrassing moment. You know what it's like, chums. I was at the LWT studios, the London studios as they were called, which are currently being pulled down. Real shame when you think, because these studios on the South Bank were literally the home of so many big hit shows, including the wonderful Upstairs Downstairs. It was a terrific place, wasn't it? And when you think about it also, you know, there are other shows like On the Buses, Blind Date, all those big spectaculars with Barry Humphries, Stanley Baxter. So much history, and of course it gets wiped away. But of course that's progression. And that really, some might say, was the idea of Upstairs Downstairs, because of course Jean Marsh played the pivotal role of the maid Rose. Now, when I was growing up as a little kid, you know, you couldn't really watch this because this was on a Sunday night. And this really was too late, you know, for school. I know it sounds strange, can you imagine this saying this to kids today, but you weren't allowed because I think it was on around about either 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So you really had to be in bed at that point. Now, what was fascinating about this was how I got introduced to Upstairs Downstairs. My mum and dad very kindly bought this book, and it was like I suppose you'd call it a souvenir brochure today, but glossy pictures, lots of stories. And I thought, wow, this is interesting, you know. And I'd always been, as many people who watch the show on a regular basis, fascinated by the hierarchy and the lower hierarchy, sort of, you know, the Edwardian and Victorian things. Why were people in this level? And that's exactly what Jean Marsh encapsulated brilliantly in her portrayal of Rose. And what was fascinating, as I said, the reason how we met was, in those days, and this is just proves how long ago this is, right? Well, the thing is, you had to buy the Evening Standard newspaper, another thing that essentially doesn't exist today. And what happened was there was a sort of, you know, news vendor inside the door of the studios. And I think it was something like 50p, and we both went for the last copy. I couldn't quite believe this is Jean Marsh, Rose, you know. And so we just struck up conversation, and we ended up having a chat in the sort of waiting area. She asked me what I was there for. And at the time I was hosting a chat show on a satellite channel. Well, you've got to start somewhere, chums, right? But this show was fabulous, but that's another story. It was some fabulous guests. Now you wouldn't get these guests on, but satellite and all of that was a totally different arena. Wonderful. But back to the brilliant Jean Marsh. So we're sitting there having this long conversation, and, you know, I said, you know, everybody must ask you about this. And people forget, of course, that all thanks to her winning an Emmy and the show being incredibly popular in America, the real precursor, if you like, to Downton Abbey, well, she did really well. And of course, consequently, doors were opened. But as you pointed out to me, that had been a long, hard slog to get to that particular point. And you know, this is the way of an actor or an actress. It's not easy. You see, she'd started off brilliantly, you know, superly trained, got into all sorts of things, you know, everything from Doctor Who to those ITC dramas, always playing the girl, as she said, sometimes the bad girl, which she preferred because they were juicier, meatier parts. And the reason, as many people now know, that Upstairs Downstairs really came to light, her and a good friend, Dame Eileen Atkins, decided, well, they weren't getting the sort of parts, or indeed nobody was writing any roles for them. So consequently, they thought, well, let's think of something ourselves. And the idea really came from talking to their individual grandparents who'd both been in service. And the stories that they said, you know, kind of like, really, does this go on? Of course, research proved it did, and more. And this really captivated the world. I mean, you know, everybody loved Upstairs Downstairs, but as she pointed out to me, in the very studios that I was at that time recorded in, which was where Upstairs Downstairs was made, she said, you know, we were treated abysmally, really, but she said it just proved how well we acted our parts. Because if you were below stairs, apparently, the staff, you know, was like, oh, yeah, here you go. The uppers, suddenly the doors were opened, they had their tea served with cups and saucers and china. She wasn't joking, you know, this has been verified. And I thought, I said, well, surely, you know, that must have irked a little bit. She said, well, as a writer, no, not really. She said she loved the whole spectrum of the way that the show was put together and the fact that it covered so much history at that point. And, you know, as you realise, it was very controversial at its time. But really, you have to remember there were, what, 3 channels then in England? So this really was why also everybody tuned in for this. But apparently the thing that may shock you, which I, kind of always, I've remembered this as a lovely memory. I said to her, what was your favourite episode? Which bit did you enjoy the most playing Rose? And she said, you know what? It wasn't actually on the show, she said, but a brilliant comedian, who I believe is still with us today, Stanley Baxter, also made shows in there in LWT. And he decided to parody every single character from Upstairs Downstairs. Now this took a lot of time, because in those days it wasn't digital, so he had him playing Mrs. Bridges, Mr. Hudson, Rose, and they just thought this was brilliant because he got everything perfect. And she said, if you could have said this is what we would have liked to have done, then that was it. And as we know, the royal family, in particular the Queen Mother, absolutely, a little bit like Catherine, the Princess of Wales today, who also loves Downton Abbey and has been there, as we know, and I've been lucky enough to meet many of the cast of Downton. I think the reason why the royals liked it, and this is just my surmise of this, is of course somebody like the Queen Mother would have remembered that era. There was no two ways about it. There was that era, wasn't there? And as she pointed out, Jean, she said, the show really took off when they brought in the beautiful Leslie Ann Down, who played, of course, Georgina Worsley, the sort of very difficult upstart of course, I think she was the ward, wasn't she, of David Bellamy. And she wasn't really behaving and all that sort of stuff. But it gave them a chance to go deep into the 1920s and, of course, the First Great War and stuff like that. And as she said, really, bringing somebody like that into the equation, absolutely. But she also pointed out, and this is what I loved about Jean as a person, she said, we were all good and cast in our own parts. So there was no rivalry. She said, Mrs. Bridges was perfect as Mrs. Bridges. Gordon Jackson, who I also met, was perfect as Hudson the butler, discreet, very loyal, but obviously had certain things along the side. Equally, I met Pauline Collins, who was wonderful in the role, and when you look at it now, you kind of see like every single person, as Jean pointed out, was well cast. She said the success surprised not only them, but also LWT, because they had no idea that this was going to be this phenomenal hit. They just saw this, and as she pointed out, it was quite cheaply made. And I'm not being rude, but she said, they didn't go all out on expenses. That's why you saw wobbly sets when Hudson picked up the phone and stuff like that, and the wall wobbled. She said today that would have been totally different. Jean, of course, went on to wonderful success in many other things, including creating The House of Eliot, another superb 1920s drama that is well worth a look if you've never checked it out. A lot of people say, when sadly people pass away, what will your memories be of Jean? A giggler, a lot of fun, and I met her on a number of occasions after that, and just really brought a lot of joy to a lot of people. And as I said to her, you could never have thought when you and Eileen sat down and scribbled this basic outline that this was going to be not only loved by the British monarchy, but around the world, and really would be your definitive role. She said she struggled for a time because everybody just saw her as Rose. Whenever she went, all the casting directors said, oh, it's Rose. She said, I just wanted to play something else. But she said, of course, you've got to be grateful for that success. And that truly. But as she pointed out to me, you've got to be grateful for that success. And that was truly what she was, really, really grateful. And I think what was fascinating about, learning her path to all of that success, was the fact that really, as she said, Upstairs Downstairs defined a generation, and many might suggest that Julian Fellowes, who created Downton Abbey via Gosford Park, the film, if you study that, Julian Fellowes had a far better access into that world because of his great connections, let's not forget that. But Dame Eileen Atkins and Jean Marsh really brought, I feel, the home of the whole era, because they were just talking to their grandparents about the memories. And she said a lot of the stories came from them. The ideas, the shape of it, and the fact that they lived in this awful attic and there was no heating and all of that sort of stuff. And she said, we got lots of huge American stars that wanted to guest star in, Upstairs Downstairs, but apparently the bosses either, she pointed out two things, couldn't afford it and didn't really want to deviate from the fact that, oh look, we've brought in X or whatever. And I thought that was a very clever move We saw that, didn't we, with Downton when they brought in Shirley MacLaine, and everybody just remembers Shirley MacLaine being in there. And that's the thing. I think, you know, what Jean and Eileen did was keep upstairs, downstairs to what it really was. Fabulous storytelling, wonderful acting, wonderful actors and actresses, and literally some golden memories of television. Jean, thank you for those wonderful televisual memories. Rest in peace. Neil Shaw in the very heart of